All right. My name is Cameron Buckner, and this is the Dixiecryptid podcast. Thank you for clicking on this video. I haven't put a podcast up in about a week. We did our full audio book of Odin's Call by D.A. Roberts. It was one of the Wild Hunt book series, and everyone seemed to enjoy it. I had already recorded that, and I took a couple of days off last week and went on about a 700-mile motorcycle ride. I had a great time, and while I was gone, I got horrible news that everybody knows about Carrie Arnold dying in a car accident last week, and it's I still can't believe it. I've had this podcast ready since maybe Friday, but I've spent all that time trying to think about what to say about it. Should I say anything? I don't know. It would be hard to explain my relationship with Carrie, but I won't talk about it now. I'll put it at the end of this video if you want to hear what I have to say, and it's going to be very short because everybody has jumped on this and made a video, and rightly so, they should, but everything that could be said about Carrie has been said. So I've got 3 short stories in this podcast and 1 long story at the end. It's about 30 minutes long. It is a story that's published in a book. I received an email from an author. I'll tell you who he is when we get there. But this is the story is based on a real occurrence that happened in his life when he was a kid. I thought it was a fantastic story, so I'm including it in this podcast. But you'll get a little preface on it when we get there. So now let's jump into this podcast. I sure hope you enjoy it. All right, here we go. Here is an email from a man in Oregon, and he doesn't give his name, but here's what he writes. I had moved to Oregon to be with my fiancée as a lifelong Chicagoan, and I was dwarfed by the forest there. I would go for long hikes in the timber without a gun, which was a mistake, considering bears and pumas were common. Like a greenhorn, I would walk for miles daydreaming. One morning I was crossing a stretch of clear-cut, daydreaming as usual, when I got that feeling that one gets when you're no longer alone. My eyes began to scan my surroundings, and I saw it immediately just 20 yards away. The huge black male Sasquatch stood stoic among the trees just at the edge. By the look on his face, he was as surprised as I was. Now these are all guesses, but it was 8 feet tall, and it had to weigh between 500 and 800 pounds. This was an enormous creature. He had gray-black skin and short black hair all over his body. He had a heavy brow covered with hair that stretched up to a conical head. Its face was rather like the one on Patty from the Patterson film. Well, I froze in terror. My mind was racing. There was no way I could outrun this thing. It could catch me and kill me without a thought. I voided myself, filling my cargo pants. I grasped a sapling and tried to step behind it, trying to hide. And I felt silly standing there with this stick between me and the biggest animal I had ever seen. I looked left and right, and then I wheeled about and was about to run, and I noticed that it calmly walked away in the direction it had come from. Well, I stood motionless for 30 minutes until I was sure it was gone. I kicked my shorts clear, and I raced home as quickly as possible. And when I got home, I told my story to my fiancée. Well, she laughed, saying that I was lucky it was a Bigfoot and not a bear. She is a native Oregonian, and she had seen Bigfoot before. I never went into the woods unarmed after that. I named this Sasquatch Big Ernie because his face resembled the actor Ernest Borgnine. Oh, that's a great story. I mean, no violence went on. This thing didn't grunt, didn't make any noises, didn't do anything. It just seemed to be surprised that you walked up. And I thought this was great. I'm not sure I wouldn't have to kick my drawers to the side too if I saw an animal that big out in the woods. This is a great story. I love these. Short, to the point, encounter stories. I think they're wonderful, and it's just got tons of information in it that confirms what pretty much everybody else says these things look like. Thanks to the writer for sending it. Here's an email from someone who wants to be anonymous. The year of my encounter was 2019. I had graduated high school the year before and had been attending the University of Idaho. And in the spring, I was feeling burned out and decided to take a long weekend back home to Priest Lake, Idaho. While I was home, I just felt the need to get out in the woods, which have always been my place of peace and rest. It was a season for picking morels, so I grabbed a basket and fired up my dirt bike and headed for my family's home, which was already a 20-minute drive from the nearest small town, and I went deep into the woods. I went to a secret spot where I'd always had good luck picking morels, and while they weren't as plentiful as normal, there were enough to keep me in the area. I had been picking morels and wandering around for an hour and decided to sit down and rest and eat a quick snack down by the small creek that flowed through the area. I'd been sitting for maybe 10 minutes when I saw a deer come walking along the creek bed. It was upwind of me and had taken no notice, so I just sat still and watched it for a few minutes until the wind shifted at 90 degrees. I caught a foul odor. Not a skunk-like odor, but more like a mixture of carrion, garbage, and feces. At that exact moment, the deer lifted its head and sniffed the air and bolted right up the bank of the creek toward me. It came close to me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, and it didn't notice me at all. A moment later, just across the creek, I heard a loud huff and a thud, and I looked over to the creek to see what I would have described as a Bigfoot, but you will soon understand why I don't. It was a shaggy, ape-like creature, something between a gorilla and an orangutan, but it was more upright. It had matte black fur that almost seemed to absorb the light. It had a partially bare face with dark skin. It had yellow teeth with huge canines. This creature was probably 7 feet tall, and I would guess 350 pounds. It wasn't skinny, but it also was not overly bulky. I was absolutely stunned, and I was frozen where I sat. Just for a few moments after I saw it, and it saw me, and the sheer rage in its eyes became terrifying. It took a few steps toward me and then stopped, and it let out a shrieking scream that was partially like the scream of a mountain lion, and partially like the roar of an actual lion, and partially indescribable. I felt it in my chest, and I slapped my hands over my ears, almost expecting to feel blood leaking out of them. This shriek went on for what seemed like a minute, but was probably just a couple of seconds. At this point, the creature was only 60 feet away from me, just across the creek and on the other bank, and I could see the spittle and drool flying off its teeth as it screamed. It took another step toward me, and it picked up a fist-sized rock and was winding back its arm to send it flying toward me when I heard another sound from just up the creek. It was a loud whoop, and it rang out, and the creature and I turned upstream to see another creature standing in the water about 100 feet away. Now, this creature was massive. It was well over 8 feet tall, and I would guess between 450 and 550 pounds, with dark red, black matted fur. It had a hairless face and a high forehead, and it was tapering to a slight cone at the top of its head. It had a broad chest and huge shoulders with extremely long arms. One of the first things I noticed was the broad, flat teeth and nails, while the other creature had sharp teeth and claws. The first creature at this point let out another shriek, and it threw the rock at the second creature, hitting it in the chest with a distinct whomp. The second creature let out a series of barking coughs. It was almost a laughing sound, and it took a few steps toward the first creature. The first creature suddenly looked panicked and spun around and ran into the brush and off into the woods. The second creature lit off after it faster than I would have ever believed possible for such a big animal. Its fur was flapping in the wind behind it, and it gave it an almost blurry appearance as it leapt up the bank in a single stride and disappeared into the woods after the first creature. Seconds later, I heard another shriek from off in the woods in the direction that they had gone, and it was followed by a much higher-pitched shriek of pain, and then a series of yelps and whines, and a moment of silence, and then a series of victorious whoops. By that time, I had finally found my ability to move, and I stood up and grabbed my basket of morals. I ran the quarter-mile to my bike as fast as I possibly could, still hearing triumphant whoops from off in the woods, and the second I got there, I kicked the engine over and tore up the old logging road I had come in on. I never bothered with my helmet until I got whipped in the face by a branch of a bush. Then I walked into the house and I took off my helmet, and my dad immediately asked me what was wrong. Well, I thought he must have seen something in my eyes, but it turned out that the branch had left a bleeding whelp on my cheek and across my nose, and I hadn't even noticed the pain. In front of my mother and my younger sister, I told my dad that I had just slipped, but later that night, alone around a campfire in the backyard, I explained to him what had really happened. He told me that I should have left the morals as a thank you and insisted that we go leave an offering first thing in the morning. We raided the refrigerator, collecting a basket of fresh vegetables, a small piece of cheese, and some peanut butter, which my dad scooped out and put in some paper cupcake wrappers. And as the sun was coming up, we left the food right where I had been sitting when I first saw the creatures. And as we pulled away in the truck a few minutes later, I heard one quiet whoop from down by the creek. I had been back to that spot several times since, but never without a sidearm, and never without a small offering of thanks to the Bigfoot that saved my life from the impersonator. Oh, I wonder what that first creature could have been. Some people call those the Gugwe, some people call them dogmen. Obviously, it was an enemy of the Bigfoot, but what a crazy story, man. This all happened back in 2009, right after this guy graduated high school. It's pretty interesting. I appreciate the writer for sending it. This gentleman didn't give me permission to say his name, but so I won't. But this is really neat here. He said, he writes, "Hi Cam, I hope this finds you well. Your video the other day about the ghost in the kitchen reminded me of the first ghost story I ever heard told to me by my mama when I was a little kid. She said it happened when her and my pawpaw were courting sometime prior to 1933. They were riding around in a friend's car and they stopped at Montgomery Baptist Church, which is a church out in the country in southwest Lincoln County, Mississippi. The reason they had given for stopping was to switch places in the car, but they all hopped back in and drove off and left Mama standing on the west side of the church watching them drive off in the distance. After a few minutes, an older lady emerged from the woods and asked her if she was okay. Mama said that she told the lady that she was fine and they were just acting fools and that they would be back directly. Not long after that, she heard the car and turned to see them coming back for her. And when she turned back around, the old woman was gone. She called for her and got no answer. When Pawpaw and their friends pulled back up, she told them about it, and they looked for the woman and they knocked on the church door thinking she might have went inside, but she was nowhere to be found. They asked Mama what the lady looked like, and she said the lady was thin and tall and had a black dress on with a white bonnet. My pawpaw and his brothers were the grave diggers for the cemetery across the road, and he said a lady fitting that description was buried there last week. I forget the woman's name, but Mama later saw a picture of her, and sure enough, it was that woman who came up to her that day. In Mama's final years, she told us that she saw people in her yard and that a little boy was among them and told her that he needed a hat. She would sometimes leave one of Pawpaw's hats on the porch table for him. Once I went by there late at night and I saw Mama sitting on the porch with the light on. And I walked back over and stayed out of sight and made my way to the north corner of her house where I could see her and what she was doing. She was sitting there talking to someone that I couldn't see, just the same as she would sit there and talk to me. And since then, I've worked with other dementia patients, and I honestly believe that our loved ones come back for us to lessen our fear about passing on. Anyway, I hope you like these and can use them. I always look forward to your videos and hope to see more now that you're unemployed. Just kidding about that. I really like that you're doing more than just Bigfoot stories lately. Take care of yourself and keep up the good work. And he signs off. I thought I was unemployed, but every time I turn around, my customers call me back and just add a little more work. It's nothing big, but I'm glad to get it. I'm glad to get the work. But what a great story. And I like how he kind of looks at this. Maybe the Lord sends old family members back to people that he knows would have a hard time with dementia or Alzheimer's. And I know those are kind of different things, but I watched my mother-in-law get old and finally die in a nursing home just down the road here. And we visited her every day. And, I had never seen anyone grow old and finally pass on like that. We were with her in the room. My wife and I were with her in the room when she died. And she went real peaceful and it wasn't, it wasn't too terrible a thing. But anyway, a lot of those people in that nursing home, they just talk to people that aren't there. You can see them talking to people who aren't there, and they'll walk up and down the halls and just yapping and jibber-jabbering and saying stuff. And I never thought it was funny. I never thought it was weird. I just thought, their minds are just, it's like we're born babies. And when we get that old, if we make it to that age, which is almost like my grandfather used to say, you turn back into a baby. And that's kind of what it's like. And I don't know. I just appreciated what the man said about people coming back and kind of helping their people they knew through the end of life. And what a nice thought. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is a nice thought. Thank you for sending the story. I appreciate it. Jordan Monsell, I think that's how he pronounces his name, Monsell, is a writer and illustrator based in Los Angeles, but he grew up in rural New England. He has a new book available on Amazon titled In the Dark Corners. It's a collection of 8 scary short stories. It's available on Amazon. I'll have a link in the description below, as well as his Etsy store where he sells his artwork, his illustration work, and I've looked it over and it's pretty cool. This is a story from the book In the Dark Corners. The title is Eyes in the Forest. Kyle was near the edge of the woods on the far end of the yard when he first saw the beasts. He had been dreaming, yet it was the type of vivid dream young children have, where upon walking, the veil between the real and the imaginary becomes almost translucent. Kyle woke, his sheets drenched in sweat, and stumbled downstairs for breakfast, anything to take his mind off the nightmare. Ellen Grady knew something was wrong as she watched her youngest son drown his pancakes in syrup, his eyes glazed as if they, too, had been coated in Vermont's own. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" she asked him, half hoping he would finish a forkful of buttermilk flapjacks before answering. But her son merely nodded. He looked pasty white, the color of his napkin, and Ellen could see that his hands trembled. After washing his breakfast down with orange juice and avoiding his mother's gaze, Kyle said, "I had another bad dream." This had been nothing new in the Grady household since they had moved from Philadelphia to the country. Michael Grady, Kyle's father, had wanted to relocate to rural Connecticut for the past 5 years. "It'll be good for the kids," Mike had told his wife. Not that she needed her arm twisted. The city had been fun when they were single, but it was no place to raise children. Their car had been broken into several times, and some of Kyle's classmates had already begun vaping, and one of them was hospitalized. The house they were looking at in the northwest corner of Ohio, a rustic 3-story colonial, had 10 acres, more than enough room for the vegetable garden Ellen had always dreamed to cultivate, as well as a healthy place for 7-year-old Kyle and his brother Luke to run around in. There was even space for a pool, a dream her husband had, like Clark Griswold on the vacation movies. Yeah, country life, totally isolated from the city, far from traffic and the smog and the crime and the crowds and the stress. She looked at her son's blank expression. Perhaps too isolated, she thought. "I'm so sorry, hon," she combed over his damp hair. "Was it very bad?" Very bad didn't begin to describe it. It was the worst, he answered softly, looking toward the window at the woods beyond the yard. He had been walking in his dream, along the edge of their property that bordered dense forests on all sides. Their new home, set halfway up the largest hill in town, could not be seen until halfway up their steep drive. They had neighbors, of course, as even most private ranchers in the most desolate areas of Texas and Arizona have neighbors, but Kyle had never seen their houses. They were through the woods, and he did not go into the woods. Chickadees and finches fluttered from branch to branch, enjoying the afternoon summer sun of his dream. Then the birds scattered in all directions, and Kyle saw the trees moving. Before he knew what was chasing him, he was sprinting back toward the house. All he knew was the things chasing him were on all fours and made an awful noise. He could hear them crashing through the brush as they exited the wood and entered the artificial security that was his backyard, and he looked back over his shoulder, and what he saw made him scream. They were dogs, 4 of them, but unlike any other dogs he had ever seen. It would have been more accurate to call them hellhounds than anything else, because hell was the only conceivable place able to birth such creatures. The beasts were about as tall as Kyle, and their heads bent like charging rams, lips drawn back revealing crocodile grins, and their eyes were like 2 hot coals and a mass of dark fur fixed on their kill. They were the stuff of fantasy, what evil sorcerers kept as pets, or were ridden into battle by goblin cavalry, dressed from snout to tail in spiky armor. They were so fantastical, so otherworldly, that Kyle was amazed he didn't immediately wake upon seeing them. Yet they were also so real. The grass being trampled beneath their taloned claws was real, and so was his fear. That couldn't have been more real. The beasts were closing in on him, and his house now seemed miles away. And it was at that point, somewhere between the woods and the mirage of the house ahead of him, that Kyle's legs surrendered. It was as if concrete had been pumped through his veins, and they became dead weight, and he stumbled forward, falling to the ground hard. He woke just as he could feel the breath of his phantom pursuers on his neck. "Moving is hard on any kid," said Mr. Grady when he got home from work. "Yes, but this is different, Michael. He's really bothered by these dreams, and they seem to be getting worse. I just think—" "I'll speak to him," he told his wife, eyes still glued to the stack of sales receipts in front of him. Sensing his wife's displeasure, he clicked his pen and added, "I'll talk to him tonight." "Hey, sport!" Michael Grady peeked around his son's bedroom door. His son was in bed, leafing through a comic book. And on the cover, Doc Savage was slicing his way through jungle vines with a machete. Kyle glanced up at his father with half a smile. "It's time to start thinking about bed, isn't it?" His father liked this expression, which was a very dad thing to say, but it made little sense to Kyle. He was already in bed, and reading helped him go to sleep. It would be like his father saying, "Time to start thinking about dinner table," when what he really meant was, "Eat your vegetables." Now his father looked about the room as if out of practice communicating with his son. Most of the walls of the bedroom were still bare, decorated with discolored shapes where past pictures had once hung. Ellen suggested they take Kyle shopping for his choice of paint color. He needs something to brighten his mood, she had said. And it wasn't until recently that Michael had begun to notice this was true. Both his sons had been adventurous back in the city, often bounding ahead of their parents, pointing and laughing, aware of the traffic. They were street smart. There had been activities at the Y, sleepovers and pizza parties, all the things Mike never thought would stop after moving to the country. Well, Luke, their older son, had been reluctant to leave his school, but during the first few weeks in their new town had quickly made close friends. Your mother tells me you had another nightmare. Seems like this is becoming a nightly thing. Kyle didn't respond. Funny, I don't recall having many bad dreams as a kid, but your mother did. Really? Oh yeah, she told me she used to have a reoccurring dream of a big purple gorilla chasing her. And one night she turned around and yelled, "Why are you chasing me?" And the gorilla just said, "I just wanted to say hello." Kyle tried to hold back his smile, but the image of his mom being chased by a friendly gorilla made him laugh. "Seriously?" he asked his father. Mr. Grady held up a hand. "Scout's honor." "Now listen, Kyle, I know these are new surroundings for you. The country is nothing like Philly. I realize that, but you really have less to worry about here than in the city." Mr. Grady paused and started making a list in his head. Bears, snakes, Lyme's disease, poison ivy, poison oak. "A lot less," he said. "Yeah, I know," Kyle answered begrudgingly, scratching his nose. "Okay," Michael thought. "Now run with it. Hey, Luke is having some friends over tomorrow. Maybe he'll let you go exploring the property with them." To say his son looked hesitant at this proposal was an understatement. He quickly shook his head. He didn't want to disappoint his father, and the truth was he wanted desperately to spend time with his brother and his friends as they explored the woods. He wanted to not be afraid, but his nightly visions were speaking to him, warning him to stay out of the forest. Play in the yard, they were saying, where you'd have some chance of reaching the house, where the monsters can't get you. "Sure thing, sport," his father said, trying to keep a positive attitude. He reached out and hugged his son. "Now sleep well." In the doorway he turned and asked, "Can I leave the light on for you?" "No, Dad, it's okay." And the room fell into darkness. By 1:30 in the morning, Kyle was deep in sleep. His eyes flitted back and forth beneath their lids. And in his dream, he was near the edge of the property again, within feet of the woods. It was just an afternoon stroll beneath the blue sky. His hands were in his pockets of his shorts, and a breeze caressing the top of each tree. A scream suddenly cut through the tranquil walk, coming from the deep in the woods, and Kyle jumped in his bed, almost knocking the bedside lamp from its stand. He was completely awake and alert in his dark bedroom, but he could still hear the screaming. This wasn't a dream. Kyle had once walked in on his father watching A Clockwork Orange, and during the scene where young Alex has his eyes forced open with metal hooks. Kyle now felt like that, except instead of being strapped to a chair, he felt frozen in his bed, and his eyes wide and beginning to water, and piercing through the window into the night. His small hands clenched the bed sheets, and his heart thundered in his chest like the sound of stampeding hounds in his dreams. The scream was blood-curdling, the scream of a woman being murdered, and the volume was all over the scale. It was loud enough to have woken him, and then retreating to a muffled sound as if a hand were trying to cover the victim's mouth. The scream faded out and then erupted once more before cutting out completely. The last sounds were so pitiful that the tears welling in his eyes began to freely pour down his cheeks. He stayed awake in bed for what seemed like hours until sheer exhaustion swept over him and he fell asleep. When daylight came, Kyle ran to his father and told him what he had heard in the night. He would not hide behind his nightmare any longer. The noise had been proof that there was something terrible in the woods, and his father was a man who needed proof. He expected his father to reach for the phone to call the police and report a murder, but instead, his father said it was a rabbit and returned to slurping his coffee the way a child slurps his soup. "A what?" Kyle said. "It was a rabbit you heard. I heard it too. It was a great horned owl, most likely." Kyle's jaw dropped, and his father had clearly lost his mind. Rabbits and owls? One of the first things Kyle remembered learning in school were the sounds animals made, and owls hooted and rabbits, well, they just wiggle their noses. His father explained, "Yes, Kyle, owls hunt rabbits. They're one of their favorite meals. And the rabbits, well, they scream. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. I first heard it while hunting in upstate New York. It scared the pants off me." He folded his newspaper. "You're going to hear a lot of new sounds out here, Kyle." "I'd rather hear car alarms," he answered. Luke's friends arrived at noon the following day, and his brother asked him if he wanted to tag along and build forts with them in the woods. Kyle thought the offer sounded rehearsed, as if their father had taken his brother aside and told him exactly what to say. Let's have a water balloon fight instead," Kyle suggested. He didn't want his brother going into the murder woods despite having a band of friends in tow. Maybe another time. You sure you won't come?" And he didn't ask a third time. Kyle watched as the group disappeared into the thick forest, his heart sinking into the pit of his stomach. It was nearly July, and the empty carcasses of firecrackers still lay strewn in the grass. It was one of those humid summer days that required cool water, and seeing how his parents had not broken ground on their swimming pool, the sprinkler would have to suffice, for the closest beach was a 2-hour drive. The pond and lake were also out of the question, since Kyle had heard his father talk of snapping turtles and their ability to separate toe from foot. Uncoiling the stubborn snake that was the garden hose, Kyle attached the sprinkler head and turned the knob with 3 rusty squeaks and delighted in the fan of water arcing before him, projecting a colorful spectrum in its mist. He was conscious of where he was in the yard, looking over his shoulder at the woods every few minutes. He was a fast runner, one of his few physical attributes. Perhaps faster than his older brother despite his shorter legs, and he knew he could easily make it to the safety of the house should anything burst forth from the trees to devour him. Looking down at his fingertips and seeing they had become small prunes, Kyle was about to call it a day when he began to feel as if he were being watched. He looked across the yard, lush and green like a golf course of a country club, expecting to see his brother or mother or someone standing there, but there was no one. The sprinkler hissed at his feet, and then something caught his eye just over the stone wall that bordered the northwestern edge of the yard. Kyle froze, a statue in the fountain, and squinted, focusing his eyes on a patch of woods behind the stone wall, where 2 eyes seemed to be staring back at him. At first thought, these were the eyes of one of the horses or cattle that grazed the meadows beyond their stone wall, a farm operating to the north of the fields which Kyle had never seen but had no reason to doubt existed. But Kyle had seen enough horses and cows in his young life to know their eyes, and those animals had eyes on the sides of their heads, and the eyes staring from the woods sat side by side. Kyle's next 2 suspects chilled him to the bone, and he shivered, stepping away from the water hitting his shoulders. The eyes belonged either to a peeping Tom, a stranger spying on him from the woods, or to a mountain lion which had been spotted in the area at higher elevations. Both had been known to be harmful to children, and so, not stopping to turn off the hose, Kyle sprinted to the front door of the house without looking back over his shoulder. "Did you have fun outside?" his mother called after him as Kyle bolted upstairs. A short while later, he could hear his father hollering from the foot of the stairs, "Will you come out here, please?" Kyle opened his bedroom door and didn't have to be told why he was being called. Each carpeted step was littered with blades of wet grass, forming the shape of a 7-year-old foot. "Dad, I saw something in the woods." "I don't want to hear it, Kyle. Now clean this up," his father said sternly. Chance, the family tabby cat, appeared around a corner and sniffed the grass with curiosity. Purring, he began to eat some, making a small smacking sound. "Thanks, Chance, but I can manage," and walked off defeated to retrieve a towel. As parents go, Kyles were very sociable people, and dinner parties had become a weekly occurrence. Being the new family in town, they wanted to make friends and acquaintances, and what better way to leave an impression than with his father's cooking and his mother's talents as a gracious hostess. Guests would leave all fed, albeit rather tipsy, and if they didn't respond in kind with an invitation to a dinner party, cocktail soiree, or backyard barbecue, their names would be added to his mother's shit list. This was not a physical list, but rather a Rolodex in her head that she would occasionally rifle through and pull out a name and with a bitter undertone say, "Oh, that's so-and-so. We invited them to our New Year's Eve party, but have not seen the inside of their home." That evening's dinner guests and potential future shit list honorees were Mr. and Mrs. Wilkinson, who lived at the end of the street in a house painted the color of unhealthy urine. Mrs. Wilkinson was a published author, but his father couldn't have cared less about that, for Mr. Wilkinson was a big game hunter, having been on safari numerous times. Kyle's father wished to hear stories of these hunts and pick his brain with questions on rifles and permits and the local land. Around 7:15, Kyle, who was quarantined to the upstairs during these adult-only parties, could hear the all-too-familiar sounds of slit drums. The year they had moved into their Connecticut home, his parents, it seemed, owned only 3 records, which they would play during these dinner parties. The best of Linda Ronstadt, the best of Joan Baez, and the soundtrack to the 1987 film Out of Africa, which was now playing, turning the home into some exotic marketplace of smells and sounds. An hour later, Kyle had grown restless for a bowl of ice cream, and he quietly made his way down the stairs into the kitchen. He could hear his father's commanding tone coming from the dining room. "I just don't get it. I thought this part of the state was supposed to have healthy population of whitetail, but it's like something has chased them off or killed the entire population in the area," his father told the dinner guest. The man responded, but his volume was much softer than Kyle's father, or perhaps the man simply didn't want their wives to overhear the conversation, who were happily engaged in their own topic of discussion involving the planting of perennials. Whatever the reason, Kyle had to tiptoe closer to the dining room to hear the man speak, and even then only heard bits and pieces. "Dead deer, carcass high up, tree, wedged." He expected his father to repeat the story back in his booming voice as if to clarify, but he just looked at the dinner guest with an expression of bewilderment. At that moment, his mother got up to fetch her dessert of homemade apple pie, keeping warm in the oven, and Kyle dashed back upstairs for risk of being seen. Sleep was fitful that evening. His mind raced to find the answer as to who or what could have placed a dead deer high in the canopy of the trees. And he wondered if it was still there, one dead eye reflecting on the moon, waiting to be snacked upon. The summer months rolled into fall, and by deer season his father had finally bagged his first buck. This was only after several frustrating days sitting in the woods, cold, and without so much as a deer track or scat pile to sight. Calling Mr. Wilkinson, they decided to try their luck in the neighboring county. Kyle's father blamed the disappearance of the deer in the woods to coyotes, but admitted that he hadn't heard the familiar chorus of yipping as a pack of hungry coyotes took down a deer. It was a good thing, too, or Kyle would have been having nightmares about that. Mr. Wilkinson also pointed out that coyotes don't hide their kills in the top of trees. And now that the trees had lost their leaves, the woods seemed somehow less intimidating to Kyle, knowing that if there were creatures in the woods looking to eat him, they would be easier to spot. So it was that on the afternoon of November 5th, Kyle skipped out the front door, his knapsack slung over his shoulder, and crossed the front porch to the garage. The smell of blood wafted from the open door, and Kyle could see his father's tractor sitting like a sleeping dragon, waiting for the snows to melt and the grass to return. Kyle glanced toward the rear of the garage where he thought the machete might be stored, and what he saw sent his stomach into a cartwheel. His father's kill hung from the rafters, its front legs bound by a thick rope. The image reminded him of torture methods used in medieval dungeons, the accused dangling about a foot off the floor and head craned back. The animal was open from gullet to groin, and the innards and organs since removed, and Kyle could make out the ribs that lined the gaping hole. Newspaper were strewn about the floor, Beetle Bailey smiling up at him, his helmet crusted in dried blood, pulled down over his eyes. But the worst part about the grisly display was the deer's tongue, limp as the head, hanging like a flap of meat, and pinched between the deer's teeth, as if trying to hold back one last scream. Kyle looked away. His father was an excellent cook, and he had always enjoyed the venison meals placed before him. But now, seeing the source of those meals in front of him, he doubted if he would ever eat deer again. He suddenly felt ashamed seeing this deer and had to remind himself of what he came inside the garage for. The smell was becoming unbearable, and he scoured the walls for the machete. He found it hanging on a hook behind his mother's gardening tools. Snatching it off the wall, he walked briskly back toward the door, catching the deer out of the corner of his eye. "Watch yourself out there," it seemed to say. Kyle marched across the lawn, filling his lungs with the chilly November air and avoiding his father's office window. He approached an area along the edge of the woods not far from where the eyes had watched him several months before. Here some stones had been removed from the wall, revealing a path cut through the trees. This is where his brother and band of merry adolescent men had made their way. He recalled that they had come back with cuts and scrapes from the many briars along the path. But they didn't have this, he thought, removing the machete from its leather scabbard, blazing in the sun's reflection. Kyle didn't like sharp things, but it was for this reason he had brought the blade. It was not, however, the only reason. Kyle only hoped the thorn bushes would be the only victim of his merciless blade. Placing one foot on a secure stone, Kyle lifted his weight up and over the wall, landing on the other side. That's one small step for Kyle, and with a newfound confidence began hacking at the thorn bushes that blocked his path, sending small twigs and nesting birds flying in all directions. He pressed on, farther from the house, until he found himself in a clearing at the base of a steep meadow, trees surrounding him on all sides. This is where he had seen the livestock grazing from the upstairs window. Looking down at his feet, he noticed what at first resembled a pile of frozen mud was actually a cow pie. He knelt down to investigate, poking at the thing with a gloved finger. Hard as a hockey puck, he ripped it from the ground. Dead grass stuck to the underside, and with a flick of his wrist flung it into the woods like a frisbee. After a few minutes, Kyle had reached the top of the meadow. Looking back, he could make out the small gray box that was his house, about the size of a model train structure. Turning, he continued along the top of the ridge until he came to a curious structure covered in dead vines near a small stream. Upon closer inspection, he discovered that the structure had once been a farming plow, but with time it had decomposed to a rusty skeleton. He crouched down, his back against the frame of the plow, and Kyle unzipped his bag and removed a sandwich. He had brought lunch on the off chance that the woods were not dangerous, that he could sit and enjoy a meal there. Halfway through his PB&J, he thought this to be true, but the atmosphere changed quickly. The dogs emerged from the trees, not the hellhounds of his nightmares, but it was a pack of coyotes. He had never seen them in the wild before, only in pictures. They were smaller than wolves and looked unhealthy. They were hungry. One of them looked to be salivating like a cartoon coyote who was always trying to chase the roadrunner. They surrounded him, 8 or 9 of them, all bobbing their heads, and none of them wishing to keep eye contact for too long. Kyle reached for the machete lying next to him when suddenly there was a sound above his head. He heard metal being struck, followed by a tickety-tick of something sharp. Something had jumped on top of the plow. Kyle flung himself around and saw what looked to be the largest of the coyotes, the pack leader, baring its teeth at him. If any of them came close to resembling the monsters of his dreams, it was this one. It was the alpha male. It will rip out my throat or be run through by my machete, Kyle thought. Running was not an option. They were faster and there were too many of them. He had to stay and fight. But at that fight or flight moment, the woods became silent around them and a powerful stench entered his nose. It was the odor of urine and feces and skunk and rot, mixed with a smell similar to that of their golden retriever after coming in from the rain. The smell burned his nostrils and made him feel sick. The coyotes smelled it too, and they could sense that something bigger was near, and they turned tail, bolting north into the timber, yipping in fear from what Kyle could not see. The coyote facing him, the leader, held its ground, but scanned the tree line. Clearly the hunger of this animal outweighed any fear of death, and instead of retreating with its pack, the animal dug its heels and leapt at the boy. Kyle shut his eyes, raising the machete up with both hands. There was a great gust of wind, followed by a loud yelp. When Kyle opened his eyes, he saw that the coyote was now 7 feet off the ground, suspended in the air by the grip of the largest man he had ever seen. Kyle blinked, his vision returning, and quickly realized this was not a man, for it was covered in head to toe in thick reddish-brown fur. Its shoulders were massive, wider than a tractor, and it stood on its legs as thick as telephone poles. It held the kicking coyote in one fist the size of a boulder, but it was the creature's face that Kyle was fixed upon. It was not quite human, yet not animal, with a flat simian nose, but eyes similar to a man. In fact, they were the same eyes he had seen peering at him through the trees weeks before. It lifted its furrowed brow, softening the deep wrinkles, and it let out a loud grunt, exhaling hair through its mouth. And then it shifted its gaze to the struggling animal, and with a flex of its bicep, snapped the coyote's neck with the ease of breaking dried spaghetti. It let out another grunt, and as if not satisfied the dog was dead, grabbed the animal by the tail with its other hand, and with the speed of a rancher lassoing a steer, it whipped the animal against the trunk of a nearby tree. There was a thunderous crack as the animal exploded on impact, sending blood and innards hurling in all directions. The beast had swung so hard that pieces of the coyote's ribs had embedded into the tree. Kyle didn't know if this was done to impress him, or if this was some kind of territorial sign to all local coyotes and any other animal for that matter. The creature uncurled its fingers, dropping the bloody stump of the tail, and it started at the boy again. Kyle was shaking uncontrollably now and had emptied his bladder, but managed to mouth the words, "Thank you." The creature's lips parted, and it grimaced at him with a mouth of dirty teeth, and Kyle wondered if this was meant to be a smile. And with that, the creature turned and with fluid steps walked back into the brush, the trees closing behind it until all he could see were the swaying branches of pine saplings. Soon the sounds of the forest returned, unmuted, rising in clarity. Kyle walked back to his house, dazed but with a little smile. For as it turned out, there were monsters in the woods after all, and the biggest of them had his back. All right, I said I would say a couple of words about Carrie, and it's going to be real short because, again, everybody has said everything that you could possibly say about what a great guy Carrie Arnold was. And maybe I'll talk about him in the future, and maybe on some live feeds we'll just reminisce about Carrie. But he was a really super good guy. He was a super nice person, very helpful to me. And you know, in these YouTube circles, the creators kind of seek each other out because we like to talk the craft, I guess is what you'd say. And I talked to maybe a half a dozen that I've become quite friendly with. But I got to know Carrie about the best. We spent some time together. I actually spent a day with him up here in North Mississippi doing an interview with Joe Flippo, and I think when Carrie got back, all the audio on that thing was messed up and he was never able to post it. But it was great spending a day with him, and I've spent hours on the phone with him and hours on Skype calls, and he's given me great advice on my channel, and he was such a determined guy. But that's, you all know that. But as far as me and Carrie's passing, all I can think of are all the things I absolutely loved about the guy. He's just one of those guys, when you think about him, you think about his smiling face, his good nature, his great attitude, his tenacious, what's the word? His tenacious attitude on just about everything he did. In his, Bigfoot wasn't Carrie's life. It wasn't his whole life. Carrie's got a wife that he's left, and he has children, and I think Linda has children. I'm not sure about the whole family situation, but Carrie the man, if you take away Bigfoot, he was great at his vocation in the oil business, and he was just a big, tall, well-built, good-looking guy. It's just such a shock, he was such a force in this Bigfoot community that I said I wasn't going to say much, but these are just things popping in my head. Now, I've been worried about what to say because by some chance, if Linda were to hear this, I don't know if she would be happy with what I'm saying or not. And Carrie's gone. Carrie's in his father's arms right now, which is the best news of all of this. The best news of all. Carrie's home. But he's left Linda, and Linda has a long road ahead of her, grieving and sorting out all the things that happen when a woman becomes a widow. And it's just hard, and I want her to know how much I love her. And I love Linda as much as I did Carrie. Linda is wonderful. She's just the most friendly, happy. They were a great couple. They are a great couple. And they're from my state, Mississippi, and all of us talked the same language. We understood each other perfectly well, and I grew up around women like Linda all my life, just happy Southern women, and friendly, and there's just not enough good things to say about her. But Carrie and Linda are just good people. They're just good people. And I think that's about all I could say. Carrie was a great friend, and a great friend is something to be cherished, whether they remain by our sides or wait for us in the next life. And I'm better for knowing Carrie, and better for having met him. And I hope that he is blessed in the next life just as much as I was blessed by knowing him. So I'll end with that. All right. Sorry to end on a sad note, but it is almost like I said earlier, it could be just a moment of celebration for Carrie. Carrie's home. Carrie's eternally home. He's in a good place, and we're the ones left here not understanding why death has to happen. And because we weren't created to die. We're created to live forever. And the understanding of death is not in our DNA. It's not inherent throughout all the thousands of generations of people who have lived and died. It always hurts. It always hurts. We'll never understand it. We'll never understand it, but it is a fact of existence. So, Carrie, I loved you in this life, and I hope to see you in the next. And Linda, I love you too. You're one of the sweetest women I've ever met. I hope you guys have a good rest of your week, and I'll be back with a podcast very soon. Thanks.